Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Lima. In the name of the organizing committee, I would like to thank you all for being here today. My name is Maria Bolboaca, and I am very happy to be hosting this event along with my colleagues. We are very happy to have more than 200 people attending this event, even though many of you are participating virtually. But we are confident that you will make the most of this opportunity. We have received excellent submissions. We have 9 papers, brilliant papers that are going to be presented today here, along with a keynote speaker of Tiziana Assenza and a panel in the end in which we are going to discuss very relevant topics related to confidence and the Peruvian economy. This event has had a very interesting history. It was planned to take place in 2020. Our organization of it, starting in 2019, was, of course, like any other event planning, affected by the COVID pandemic. We have postponed it to the time when we hoped we could have it again in person. Unfortunately, the uncertainty is still very high, so we have decided, short notice, I would say, to have this event hybrid. And now we are very happy to have done it, because this, as I said earlier, gives us the opportunity to have so many of you from all over the world actually attending our workshop. I will say briefly some few technicalities, very short, to make sure that we are at least trying to keep the schedule. What the aim is that we will have these 4 contributors sessions, then the keynote, and in the end the panel on the schedule. So each presentation has half an hour allocated. I will like to go now into the introduction of our keynote, Tiziana Assenza. We are very happy to have the opportunity to have a female keynote. You know, in macroeconomics, it's a male-dominated field. So having not only a macroeconomist, but also a female macroeconomist doing the talk, it's a great thing. And Tiziana is not only a macroeconomist and a female, but also doing behavioral macroeconomics, which adds up on the complexity of the work that she does. Tiziana has her PhD since 2006 from the Catholic University in Milan, where she has been an assistant professor and an associate professor. Currently, she is associate professor at the Toulouse School of Economics. She has great publications in top field journals, like the Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control, and a recent publication in the Journal of Monetary Economics, titled Managing Self-Organization of Expectations Through Monetary Policy, a Macro Experiment. And talking about macro experiments, today she's going to talk about another experiment, and the title of her work is the ability to distill the truth. So let's give the floor to her. I think you would like to hear about how we can learn to distill the truth. Tiziana, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, you will have 50 minutes for the talk and 10 minutes for the Q&A, if that's fine with you. I will let you know 5 minutes before the end about your remaining time, okay?
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So let me first of all try to share the slides. Can you see my slides? Yeah. Okay. So first of all, let me thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present today, to invite me to give this plenary. And let me thank Maria for this really nice introduction. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is a brand new paper that, so it's the first time that it's presented. So any comment or suggestion or it's more than welcome. So as you can see from the title, so this is first of all a joint work with Alberto Cardaci, that is assistant professor at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, that was also previously at Cattolica in Milano. So as you can see from the title, essentially what we do in this paper is to talk about what, according to this comic that has been circulated a few weeks ago on the social media, we can define the fifth night of the apocalypse. And so the paper will be about misinformation. So that, of course, is can be absolutely linked to confidence, and it can somehow impact in the confidence in the economy. So let me be a bit more precise on what I mean. So everybody agrees on the fact that when we talk in economics about confidence, we link confidence with subjects' beliefs, with individuals' beliefs, especially about the short-run economic outcomes. And what we know is that there are, and this has been widely studied in different contributions, is that there are different phenomena that can indeed impact, that can have an effect on these beliefs. Just to mention a few of them, let's think about economic policy, the role of news in affecting confidence, or the role of fundamental shocks. What we can say in general is that any piece of information that agents think matters can have an impact on beliefs of the agents, and in turn it can have an impact, a non-negligible impact also on confidence. So if this is true, then what if in the economy we have an evil agent that whose aim is to manipulate information with the goal of alter individuals' belief? So if this agent is successful indeed in manipulating information and altering individuals' beliefs, can in turn have a significant impact on confidence with all the events that can follow after that. So that's where we can claim that there is a clear role for the spreading of made-up information and in general of misinformation in the economy. So that said, of course, the first thing as an economist that we should ask ourselves is whether indeed the cost that the economy pays for the spreading of misinformation is something that we need to worry about or not. So there is a recent survey that was run a few years ago in which it was found that around 60% of Americans indeed argue that the dissemination of made-up information, so fake news and misinformation, has made it more difficult for them to take important financial decisions. And in fact, what we can say is that since economic actors in general base their decisions, such as, for example, consumption or investment on the information that they obtain, then in principle, the diffusion of information that is inaccurate or even false can in turn lead to some non-negligible inefficiencies that may harm not only individuals, but also the economy as a whole. And this can happen through different channels. I mean, if we think, for example, about the example of the current pandemic, about the huge amount of misinformation that has been circulating on the virus or the vaccines and so on and so forth, we could somehow estimate that this has a non-negligible impact in terms, for example, of costs for public health. Or think about the cost that is imposed by the spread of misinformation during election campaigns, or the cost that, for example, companies need to face in order to deal with the reputation management costs that they face once misinformation about the company is spread. So that said, there is a nice work by Cavazos in 2019 that estimates the yearly cost of financial and public health misinformation for the US being around 26.2 billion. So this equals roughly 0.14% of US GDP in 2019. So this number like this, you can think, okay, it's not that big, so maybe it's not such a big deal. But then if you just recompute the magnitude of this number following Lucas 1987, then what you find out is that this number corresponds to more than 4 times the welfare cost of business cycle as expressed in permanent consumption. So maybe there is something there that we should worry about. There is also evidence that despite the fact that false information spreads faster and more broadly than true information, and this is especially true when we look at the spread of misinformation on social media, still around more than 80% of Americans and around 70% of Europeans feel that they are at least somewhat confident about their ability to detect false or inaccurate information. So, of course, in a pure rational world, if we think about a model in which agents are purely rational, then there is no role for made-up news or for misinformation. But what if, on the contrary, individuals detect misinformation only with some probability? So if this is the case, then this can raise some concerns in terms of how good really people are in spotting false information and how good they think they are. Because if they think they are better than what they are in reality, this could somehow induce them to underestimate the problem per se and put less attention to misinformation, and therefore they could in principle face a higher probability to fall for fake news. So what we do in this paper, what we want to do is essentially to measure the accuracy of people's beliefs about their own ability to detect false or inaccurate information. And in particular, we measure it by showing individuals some news headlines. I will give you more details in a few minutes about it. Then what we do, moreover, is to estimate which is the true ability of people in detecting inaccurate information. And we also give an estimation of the causal effect of revealing to individuals their true ability. And we measure this causal effect on 2 aspects. First of all, we measure the causal effects of revealing the true ability to people on their beliefs about their own ability of distilling the truth. So what we want to measure is whether by informing them about their true ability has an impact in terms of belief updating. And if yes, in which direction the update and which is the magnitude of this update. And secondly, we estimate the causal effect of revealing the true ability to individuals on their willingness to pay to hedge against the risk of misinformation. So the risk of being harmed by made-up news and information. And again, here what we want to measure is whether this willingness to pay to hedge against the risk of misinformation is significantly increases because of the information treatment. So before going into the details of the paper, let me just give you, first of all, what we mean exactly with misinformation. So throughout the paper, when I will talk about misinformation or fake news, what we will refer to is the information that is demonstrably false. And this is in line with the definition of misinformation that has been given by Alcott and co-authors, and recently it's the same type of definition of misinformation that Acemoglu and co-authors use in a recent paper. The method that we use is an online survey with a randomized information experiment of a representative sample of the US population. And in particular, what we include in our survey is an incentivized news accuracy detection task, in which we will ask subjects to determine, to assess the accuracy of the information that is contained in a series of news headlines that we will show them. And what we do to make sure that the assessment of individuals is not affected by their political views or by their knowledge of the topics. In the selection of the headlines, we include a vastly heterogeneous set of news, both in terms of sources and topics. And these news have all been fact-checked by independent organizations such as PolitiFact, FactCheck.org, or Osnops. So we contribute essentially to three main strands of literature. The first one is the literature on information experiments and randomized control trials. And in particular, what we do in our paper is to design a survey that aligns this literature, that uses surveys with information experiments and randomized control trials in economics. This is a growing literature, and here I'm citing just few of the contributions. What we do more with respect to what it has already done is consists in the fact that our paper is the first that applies this method to study beliefs about news accuracy detection ability. The second strand of literature to which we contribute is a literature that studies the role of misinformation that has been mainly developed in psychology and political science. And in particular, we, while in all these studies, what they provide is a characterization of the individuals that are more susceptible to misinformation. What is also important to understand is whether and to what extent subjects are aware of their vulnerability. If they are vulnerable, what is important to understand is whether they are aware of it. And so what we do is to take a step in this direction, and we elicit individual beliefs about their own ability to discern accurate information we provide an assessment of the precision of such beliefs. More importantly, our paper, compared to this strand of literature, is also the first study that exogenously shifts people's beliefs and shows how to improve their precision when it comes to misinformation. And finally, a third strand of literature to which we contribute is the literature that studies how individuals react to feedback about their own characteristics and abilities. So here there are also quite a number of studies, and these studies typically use probabilistic information treatments that introduce motivated beliefs and non-Bayesian behavior, with finding that there is an asymmetric reaction to the feedbacks that are provided to the agents. So we contribute to this literature by showing that subjects that exhibit greater conservatism to a positive feedback with respect to a negative feedback is driven by gender differences, and this happens also in our setup, in which we have a non-probabilistic information provision. So in a sense, we put ourselves in the worst scenario to obtain this result, but still we find it. Let me briefly anticipate which are the main findings of our study. So first of all, we find, and this is in line with the previous surveys that I was mentioning, that around 85% of respondents have imprecise belief with an average error in beliefs that is more than 1/3 of the true ability. And moreover, informing subjects about their true ability has a significant effect in improving the precision of their posterior beliefs. And what we observed is that there is an average downward adjustment in beliefs with respect to the control group in the survey. So in fact, what we have is that while both subjects, so the one that receive a positive feedback and the ones that receive a negative feedback, adjust their beliefs in the direction of the information that we provide to them, the magnitude of this update is larger among those participants that receive a negative feedback, where a participant that receives a negative feedback is a participant that is overconfident about his own ability. And finally, what we find is also an asymmetric reaction. And we show that there is a stronger conservatism among subjects that receive a positive feedback. So those subjects that were underconfident about their own ability. And this finding is driven by gender differences. In fact, what we find is that relative to men, women have a much larger probability of being underconfident with respect to their own ability, and therefore receiving a positive feedback, and therefore they have also a higher probability of receiving a positive feedback, and this is consistent with the abundant evidence that women tend to be more pessimistic when it comes to evaluate their own abilities relative to men. In addition, what we find is that while men assign larger and approximately equal weights to both positive and negative feedbacks, when it comes to women, the story is different. So what we find is that they exhibit a relatively stronger reaction to negative feedback, so with a much lower weights to positive ones. So the ones that start being underconfident, they put less weight to the positive news that they are better than they thought. While the ones that were overconfident, when they need to update, they put a higher weight to the bad news that they were indeed overestimating their ability. And this result, again, is in line with existing evidence that men and women respond differently to informative signals when it comes to information about their own ability. And finally, what we find is that informing subjects about their true ability significantly increases the willingness to hedge against misinformation risk for subjects that have a greater risk aversion. Okay, so what we find is that there is a muted response of the treatment, but this muted response is hiding some heterogeneity in the response of agents. And we find that the response in terms of the willingness to hedge against misinformation risk is linked to individuals' risk aversion. The higher is the risk aversion, the more agents are willing to hedge against the misinformation risk. So this is the roadmap of the presentation from now on. So I will briefly discuss the survey, the data, and the sample, and then I will go through the description of the results, and then I will conclude. So let me start with the description of the sample and the data collection. So we have, as I was anticipating, a sample of that is representative of the US population, and in which we include respondents that are aged more than 18 years old and that were born in the US. We collected 2,413 responses over the period between mid-June and the beginning of August last year, in 2021. In order to guarantee the quality of the observations that we collect, on top of the standard quality checks that are included when you run this type of surveys, we also include an attention check in order to screen out of the survey all those agents that in principle tend not to read your questions and respond just randomly. The median completion time for the survey is about 20 minutes, and the sample is representative along different dimensions of the US population. For example, it is representative in terms of age, gender, education, income, but also average household size, or we match really well the share of Black and African Americans in the population, and also the employment rate. And moreover, the sample is balanced across the control and the treatment group. So let me give you just the skeleton of the survey. So start looking at this slide from the left. So essentially, the survey is divided. The main core of the survey consists of our news accuracy detection task that I will describe in a moment. And before the agents are asked to go through this task, we have different blocks through which we collect different information. So we have a first block in which we have some background questions, and another block in which we ask the prior of the agent about an economic decision that includes the way in which we measure the willingness of the agents to hedge against the misinformation risk. I will give you more details about the way in which we do it. And then we also elicit the participants' prior general beliefs about their ability to discern accurate information, and about what they think the average American, how much the average American is good in distinguishing accurate and inaccurate information. Then, in the main core of the survey structure, we have the news accuracy detection task, in which the total participants are divided into two groups. One group is the control group, and the other group is the information treatment group. So that's the group to which we will indeed provide the information about their true-ability, while this information is not provided to the control group. And then there are a few more blocks in which we gather a few more extra information about the agents, and then we also elicit the posterior about their economic decision and the posterior about their general belief. So let me briefly discuss what we do in the news accuracy detection task. So what you see here on the left of the slide is a screenshot of how the agents will see the news that we ask them to assess. And in particular, what we do is to explain to them that their task in this part of the survey consists in assessing the accuracy of a set of news headlines, and in particular of 20 headlines that will be shown them one after the other. And we inform them that all these news items have been fact-checked by independent third parties. And we tell them that some of these news have been fact-checked as being false, other as being true. So some have been fact-checked as being accurate, other as inaccurate. So the way in which we build our data set of news headlines is such that we have 10 that have been fact-checked as accurate and 10 that have been fact-checked as inaccurate. But we do not provide this information on the distribution to agents. Then we also explain them that we will incentivize this task. And the way in which we do it is to tell them that for each news for which they give the correct assessment, so that's an assessment is in line with the fact checker, then they will score 1 point. And so they can score up to a max of 20 points. And we also tell them that we will convert these points according to a conversion rate such that 1 point corresponds to $5. So this means that in principle, if they score 20 points, they can accumulate up to $100. Then what we do is to inform them that only 2 out of all the participants, and they don't know how many they are, will be randomly selected, and the payoff that they accumulate will be donated to a charity that they have to choose between Feeding America, that is the biggest food bank in US, and the American Red Cross. So, as I was saying, on the left, what you see is a screenshot of the way in which they will see all the 20 news headlines. So there is the headline, and then we also add, to make it a little bit more informative, such just few lines that are a few highlights about the news that are sentences that are usually taken from the beginning of the article from which the news has been taken. And then we also give them information about when this news was published for the first time. And then we ask them to answer to the question, to the best of your knowledge, is the information in the above news item accurate? And then they have to say yes or no. Importantly here, differently from what has been done in the literature on misinformation that I was mentioning at the beginning, we do not introduce any picture or any element that could somehow have an impact on the assessment of the agents, because we want really to focus on the assessment of the content of the information. So there are no pictures or no grammatical errors and so on and so forth. There are some characteristics that somehow are typical of fake news. So let me give you a timeline of how the news accuracy detection task is organized. So essentially, we organize it into 2 parts. So, and in the first part, what we do is to elicit the respondents' prior belief about their ability to discern accurate from inaccurate information. So essentially, we tell them, after we have been explaining them the task, we tell them, okay, now we will show you 10 news headlines. How many points do you think you will score? And then they are instructed that they have to give a number between 0 and 10. Then, once we elicit the prior belief, the first part of the task starts. So we show the 10 headlines, one after the other, and they have to assess the accuracy of these headlines. Once they are done, we elicit a mid-task belief. So once the first 10 news headlines have been showed, we ask them to answer a question that says, you saw 10 news headlines, so how many points do you think you scored? So like this, we can measure whether there is somehow already a revision of the belief of the agents that is due just to the exposure to the task. And after that, the second part starts. So we tell them, now we will show you 10 more headlines, and the task starts. And once they are done, we ask them again the posterior belief. So we tell them, you saw another set of 10 news items, how many points do you think you scored? So essentially, we elicit the belief about their own ability at three different times during the task. The prior, in the middle, between the first 10 and the second 10 set of headlines, and then at the end, so we elicit the posterior. Importantly, once we have been eliciting the mid-task belief, and just before the starting of the second part, we provide 50% of the sample with the information about their true score in the first part. So imagine that you have a subject that was giving you as a prior belief, I will score 4 out of 10. Then we ask the mid-task belief, and the subject says, okay, I think I scored 6 out of 10. And then to this subject, if this subject is in information treatment, we tell to this subject before starting the second part, I mean, you saw 10 news headlines and your true score is 2 out of 10. And then the second part starts. So like this, we can, confronting the treatment group with the control group that doesn't receive this information, we can indeed find if there is any causal effect of providing this information to participants. Then there are the other blocks of the survey. So let me briefly go through them, in which essentially what we do is to ask standard demographics information to the participants, and also some socioeconomic background information. So for example, their income, their education, their religion, or the employment status, or and also, for example, their political affiliation. Moreover, to have a better characterization of the attitudes towards the news and information, we also included a quite rich set of questions about their level of trust in general in others, in non-partisan fact checkers, because we want to control whether this has an impact on our results. Or we also collect information on individuals in terms of their news consumption habits, and in terms of which are their major source of news. For example, TV, social media, newspapers, online or printed, and so on. And we also include a question that measures the level of trust on each of these different news sources. And then we also add a question through which we want to understand whether and to what extent subjects consider misinformation being a problem for the country, and whether they think they have been already harmed by made-up news and information. Then in the background, we also have some more questions that allow us to better characterize these individuals. And in particular, we have a set of questions that have been developed by Anderson Small-Page, through which we can measure which is the conspirational beliefs of agents, so their attitude to believe in conspiracy theories. Then we use the cognitive reflection test developed by Frederick in order to measure whether they are, in Kahneman words, slow or fast thinkers. And then we also have a sentence comprehension test that introduces a varying level of syntactic complexity, because this will allow us to control whether their assessment is somehow influenced by their capacity to understand what they are reading. And finally, we also measure their risk aversion through a standard question that has been developed in Doneman and co-authors in 2011. Now, let me describe to you how we write down the economic decision. So essentially what we do is to rely on what is called the reported preferences approach, which is used to elicit quantitative variations in hypothetical scenarios. And specifically what we do is to tell subjects the following. So suppose that you are given $1,000 that you can split between buying consumption goods and two types of insurance contracts. type A contract covers you against the risk of being harmed by made-up news and information, and type B contract covers you against the risk of being unable to cover your health expenses. And then we ask them, how would you split this $1,000 budget between these three items? And they have to split the $1,000. And this choice, importantly, is presented before and after the news accuracy detection task. So like this, what we do is to elicit the prior and the posterior hypothetical allocation decision of the agents. And this will allow us to measure whether there is an impact of providing to the treated group the information about the probability in terms of changing this economic decision. So hedging against the misinformation risk. And finally, as I was anticipating at the beginning, we also elicit respondents' general qualitative beliefs about their own and the average ability of the average American to recognize misinformation. And we also elicit their confidence on these answers. So this will allow us to compute the confidence intervals. I forgot to say that we elicit the confidence on their answers also in the news accuracy detection tasks for the prior, the mid task, and the posterior belief. So every time that they tell us I will score 3 out of 10, then we ask them how sure they are about this answer. Like this, we can also measure the confidence intervals. And again, the general beliefs are elicited before and after the news accuracy detection task. How am I doing with time?
You have 10 minutes. Okay,
great. So let me briefly go through the results. So the first thing that we want to understand is whether how good people, how accurate is the belief of agents in terms of their ability to detect information accuracy. So before the beginning of the accuracy task in the general belief question, what we find is that about 80% of subjects consider themselves generally good in identifying misinformation. And this is in line with the surveys that I was mentioning at the beginning that were run on Americans and Europeans. Then we also find that only 37% of them think also that the average American is good. And this somehow is an evidence for overplacement. And despite such a strong confidence in their own ability, the average score that we measure is 12 out of 20. So this corresponds to a correct assessment of the news headlines of about 62%. And there is no difference, no significant difference between accurate and inaccurate headlines that are shown to the participants. So in this plot, what we see is which are the characteristics of the agent that makes the higher score. So what you can see here is that the higher score is associated with a higher score in the cognitive reflection test. So in a higher score in the sentence comprehension test, but also it's associated with the fact that the agent think that fake news is a problem for the country, a higher degree of trust in fact-checking, and others. Then when it goes to the association of lower scores, then what we see is that a lower score is associated. So if you look at gender with being a woman, then it is also associated with being a Republican, and with the agent saying that she thinks she has already been harmed by fake news, and it is also associated with those agents for which the major source of information are social media. So these are the ones that have lower score in the detection task. So We measure the belief precision by looking at the distribution of the error, where the error is measured as the absolute difference between the belief of the agent and the true score of the agent. And of course, we can measure the error in terms of the prior belief, the mean-task belief, and the posterior belief. Okay, so we can measure the error at each of these 3 points during the detection task when we elicit the three beliefs. So what we find is the following. So for prior beliefs, we find that the error I is equal to 2.26 points on average. And this error amounts to more than 40% of the true score on average. Hence, what we can say is that prior beliefs exhibit a very large deviation from the true scores in the first part of the task. Then when it comes, once the agents have been exposed to the first part of the task, and we measure again these measures, making use of the mid-task belief, what we find is that the exposure to the first 10 used clients should, while we would expect that this should allow subjects to familiarize with the task, and therefore this should lead to changes in beliefs and it should improve the precision, this happens, but the magnitude of these effects is not that big. So in fact, what we find is that the average value of the error decreases to 1.97 points for the mid-task belief, and the error amounts to 36% of the true score. However, if you look, still 85% of the subjects hold imprecise belief. So in terms of precision of the belief, we don't have a big improvement due to the pure exposition to the task. So the first result, therefore, is that we have more than 80% of the subjects that hold imprecise belief about their true ability to discern accurate from inaccurate information. And this happens even after they've been familiarizing with the first part of the task. And the average error in beliefs is around 36% of the true score. Moreover, what we find is that overconfident subjects show a lower performance than underconfident subjects, both in the prior and in the mid-task belief. And then a question that we would ask is, who has the more accurate belief? And what we find is that lower error in the mid-task belief is associated with higher cognitive reflection and higher degree of text comprehension. Moreover, the error of overconfident individuals is significantly greater than the error of underconfident. So with these findings, the first thing that we could say is that it seems that overconfident subjects seem particularly susceptible to misinformation. Then what we do next is to measure the treatment effect on the precision of the belief. In order to do so, we make use of a standard OLS regression, in which essentially what we do is to run the following OLS regression. So POE here refers to the error in the posterior belief, so the absolute difference between the posterior belief and the true score. And SI represents the treatment dummy. So it is equal to 1 if the agent receives in the middle the information about the true ability, the true score. MTE here measures the error in the mid-task belief. So the difference between the mid-task belief and the true score in the first part. So here, let me just mention that this parameter, this coefficient alpha 1, then is identifying the average difference in the error of the posterior belief in the treatment group relative to the control group. And we use robust standard errors throughout the rest of the analysis. So what we find here is that the information treatment significantly improves the precision of the beliefs. In fact, the error in the posterior decreases by significantly by 0.2 points with respect to the control group. And this corresponds to about almost 10% greater precision of posterior beliefs of the treated group with respect to the control group. And this result is robust to different specifications of the regression model. Secondly, what we do is to estimate whether there is any relation between the precision of the belief and the sign of the feedback that the agents receive. So recall that if the agent was initially overconfident and an agent that receives a negative sign is an agent that was initially overconfident, while an agent that receives a positive sign is an agent that was initially underconfident. So, and in principle, what it can happen is that subjects may exhibit heterogeneous responses to the revelation of their true score, depending on the sign of the feedback that they receive. So whether their revealed score is above or below their mid-task belief. So to test this, we run the OLS that you see here on the slide, and that has exactly the same specification, with the only difference that instead of the dummy for the treatment, now we include the sign of the signal that the agents receive. And what we find is that essentially to receive, there is an asymmetry in the reaction. So to receive a negative feedback significantly improves the belief's precision of the agents. In fact, it decreases the posterior error significantly by 0.37 points with respect to the control group. But this corresponds to an improvement in precision that is about 17% greater than the precision that corresponds to about a 17% higher precision of the treated group with respect to the control group. And these results are robust to the different specification of the model.
Tiziana,
then when it comes to the... Yes?
5 minutes left.
5 minutes, okay. Yes. Then when it comes to the positive feedback effect, what we find is that this has a much weaker effect, and on top of that is not robust to different specifications of the model. So a second result consists in the fact that to reveal the true score to individuals improves significantly the average precision of the belief relative to the control group. And this effect is driven by overconfident individuals. So those participants that receive a negative feedback, whose belief precision improves relative to the control group. Finally, what we want to measure is whether there is an impact in terms of belief updating. So given the 5 minutes that are remaining, let me just anticipate you the final result. So here what we find is the following. Essentially, the informing participants of the true score induces an average downward updating of beliefs. And this effect is stronger among those subjects that receive a negative feedback, so among those subjects that were overconfident. And this explains the bigger improvement in belief precisions among these subjects. Moreover, the stronger conservatism that we find also stronger conservatism among subjects with positive feedback, and this is driven by a larger presence of women in this group. So the majority of women, in the group of agents that receive a positive feedback, the majority is represented by women. So recall that an agent that receives a positive feedback is an agent that was initially underconfident. And women resist more in incorporating this positive news about their ability. So they are more conservative, and therefore they update less. So that's why we find a stronger conservatism among the subjects that receive a positive feedback. Finally, when it comes to the impact on the economic decision, so the initial allocation of the budget is such that on average agents give around 20% of the 1,000 hypothetical dollars budget to the misinformation insurance. And again here, what we want to measure is the impact of the information treatment. So the first thing that we find is that there is an exposure effects of the agents. So what I mean is the following. The only fact of being exposed to the task induces a change in the willingness to pay for the misinformation insurance. And in fact, what we find is that there is a significant increase of the willingness to pay for this misinformation insurance, and such that we observe that there is an increase in the budget share that is devoted to misinformation insurance. Why this happens? Because of the exposition to the task, the pure exposition, we find that participants that consider made-up news and information at least a moderately big problem for the country increases. So it is as if people become more aware of the problem, they become more scared about the problem for the pure fact of being exposed to this task. And because of that, then the news accuracy detection task seems to increase their awareness of the misinformation problem, and in turn, this has an impact on their willingness to hedge against the misinformation risk. Finding this result, then we find a muted effect of the treatment and the information treatment in terms of willingness to pay for the misinformation insurance. But then what we want to see is whether the information on the news accuracy detection abilities affect this willingness to hedge for misinformation risk. And what we find is that we don't find an effect by regressing the change in the willingness to pay, just because both in the case of the pure information treatment effect, but also in terms when we look at the sign of the signal that agents receive. So this can be due to heterogeneous reactions. And what we find after different analysis is that what it matters is risk aversion. So essentially the information treatment produces a significant change in the budget that is allocated to the misinformation insurance for those agents that have a greater risk-taking with respect to the control group. And what we do is to estimate this change in the willingness to pay at each level of the risk-taking. And here on this graph, you see exactly the result. So subjects' willingness to pay for the misinformation insurance exhibits a muted response to the information treatment. However, the treatment produces a positive variation in the willingness to pay among those subjects that are more risk-averse. So the more risk-averse the agents are, the more we find an impact of the information treatment on this type of subjects. And then let me just stop here. This slide summarizes what I've been discussing so far. Thanks.
Thank you, Tiziana, for this great talk. We are now open for questions. If there are more from the room, there is one in the chat. Is there any risk of having a selection bias in the survey sample?
No, because I mean, what we do, so this survey sample has been collected by making use of the company Qualtrics that is specialized in this type of studies. And we explicitly asked to impose some quotas in terms of representativeness of the sample in order to avoid that there is some bias. And on top of that, the split among the control and the treated group is totally random. So the randomness in the split should avoid any bias in this sense.
Okay.
Yes.
I was surprised in your results that you find the difference between women and men, but not a difference by age. I would have suspected that young versus old would make a difference, and still you don't find that.
We don't. I mean, before concluding with this difference in terms of gender, we did indeed exploited all the possible characteristics of the agents. So the age, their political views, their degree of education, their degree of income, the type of consumption consumption in terms of news. But really the only element that is able to explain this difference is gender. I mean, we were also somehow surprised, but also somehow upset about the result, because we were expecting something more than gender.
Yeah, I mean, I would have expected it as well, but already finding a significant difference between women and men, I think it's a very valuable outcome. And one more thing on my side. So what would be the case if you would try to generalize it? I was wondering whether applying it to the US is not influencing the results, because we know all the discussion about fake news in the US, and I was wondering whether the people, the respondents, may be more aware of the idea of misinformation. They may have this influence compared to people in other countries. Do you think there could be a difference?
Well, I cannot give a clear answer on this point, because of course what I should do is to run the same type of experiment with a different population. That could be some country in Europe. But I must say that while I would agree with you, if I would have done this during let's say 5-6 years ago, during the elections in US, where there was a big issue with the spread of misinformation. I mean, it was Trump that was connecting this name for misinformation, fake news. Nowadays, I'm not sure that this concern, it still applies because of the COVID pandemic. I mean, with all the spread of misinformation during the pandemic, I would say that all over the world, the knowledge about the existence of misinformation is growing more and more. I mean, I have an example of an impact of a fake news that was spread during the pandemic in India that caused a collapse of the selling of chickens, and in turn of the selling of food for chickens, because at a certain point during the pandemic there was a news that was circulating a lot in social networks assessing that the coronavirus was you could get infected by eating chicken. So there was a big drop in the sales of chickens, and essentially the producers of chickens, what they were doing in order to avoid to face the cost of giving them foods, they were burying them alive. But this, of course, then had an impact also on the companies that were selling the food for chickens and so on and so forth. And there was also quite an amount of people that lost their job because of that. That to say that I would say that nowadays misinformation is a concern all around the world.
And what do you think would be solutions? So I've seen that you had all these differences, like that the fake news will spread more via social media. So are there any policy advices coming out of this analysis of yours?
Well, there are the studies that I was mentioning about misinformation that go in the direction of somehow nudging people, making more salient to think about accuracy of news. Because what they find is that when you indeed make more salient in the eyes of people that they need to think about the accuracy of the news, especially when they use social media, this has an impact in terms of the amount of news that they share on social media. And in particular, if you make more salient to think about the accuracy of the news, people tend to share less fake news on social media than because they go more on the internet to check for the news before sharing it. And in this sense, for example, I know that Twitter started an initiative last year in which essentially what they are trying to promote is a sort of social fact-checking. So where are the users themselves that participate in the community to fact-check the news that are circulated in the social network. Then, there are other studies that show that to teach people how to build up fake news works like a vaccine, because then if you know how you build it, you are able to recognize it. and this should in principle allow to decrease the amount of fake news that are circulated. Of course, if you don't think about malicious agents, then that's another issue.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Tiziana, for the great talk. Now for everyone, we are gonna take a half an hour break and we resume then at, what is it, at 10:45. Thank you, Tiziana, again.
Thanks again to you for organizing this workshop.
And see you soon.
You.